On March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur and headed for Beijing. It was supposed to be a routine overnight flight. There were 239 people on board, passengers from 14 countries, 12 crew members, families, engineers, artists, elderly couples, young parents, and 3 children. The youngest was only 2 years old. They settled into their seats, turned off their phones, closed their eyes, and expected to wake up in China. None of them knew their aircraft would never land. And 11 years later, the world still cannot say exactly what happened. At first, everything looked normal. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 climbed over the South China Sea, locked onto its route, and moved through the night like thousands of flights before it. 38 minutes after takeoff, the cockpit made one final transmission. "Good night. Malaysian Three-Seven-Zero." It was ordinary. Pilots say things like that every day when leaving one control zone and entering another. But MH370 never contacted Vietnamese air traffic control. Within minutes, one of the most advanced passenger aircraft ever built had vanished. This was not a small private plane. This was a Boeing 777, 63 meters long, powered by 2 massive engines, protected by redundant systems, built to cross oceans safely. Boeing 777s do not simply disappear, but at 1:21 a.m., this one did. It did not crash on radar. It did not explode. It did not send a distress call. It simply dropped off civilian screens as if someone had switched off its identity. The reason was chilling. The aircraft's transponder had stopped broadcasting its location, altitude, and speed. Without it, civilian controllers could no longer see the plane properly. Almost at the same time, another system went silent too, the one that sent technical data from the aircraft back to the ground. 2 independent communication systems stopped working almost together. A coincidence was possible, but barely. One system could be disabled from the cockpit. The other required deeper knowledge of the aircraft's electronics. This was not something a panicked passenger could casually do. Someone knew the machine. Then came the delay that would haunt the investigation forever. Vietnamese controllers waited for contact. Malaysian controllers assumed the aircraft had already been handed off. Hours slipped away before both sides fully understood the truth. The plane had not spoken to anyone. A massive search began in the South China Sea. Ships and aircraft from multiple countries scanned the water for wreckage, fuel stains, life jackets, anything. They found nothing, because MH370 was not there. In Beijing and Kuala Lumpur, families waited in hotels for news that never came. Officials stood before cameras and repeated empty phrases. Every possibility was being considered. Everything was being done. But behind those words was a terrifying reality. No one knew where the plane was. Then, military radar changed the entire story. Malaysian investigators reviewed recordings from defense radar, not civilian screens that depend on aircraft signals, but real radar that detects large objects in the sky. And what they saw was impossible to ignore. After disappearing from civilian radar, MH370 did not fall into the sea. It turned. The aircraft made a sharp left maneuver, crossed the Malaysian peninsula from east to west, passed back over the country it had just departed from, and flew toward the Strait of Malacca. Then it turned northwest, moved around Sumatra, and vanished beyond military radar range. It was flying in the opposite direction from Beijing. And the military had seen it. An unidentified aircraft, flying without normal communication, crossed national airspace at night. And no fighter jets were launched. No interception. No visual contact. No warning to civilian controllers. Nothing. That failure remains one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case. Military radar exists for exactly this reason. to detect aircraft that should not be there and force a response. A silent jet crossing your airspace at night is not a small irregularity. It is the scenario air defense systems are built for. Maybe an operator assumed it was a civilian aircraft with a broken transponder. Maybe no one paid enough attention. Or maybe the radar recording was only reviewed after the fact. That possibility is the worst of all, because if Malaysia had reacted in real time, fighter jets might have reached MH370. They might have seen the aircraft. They might have contacted the cockpit. They might have changed the ending. We will never know. But after the aircraft disappeared from military radar, how do we know it kept flying? That is where the story becomes even stranger. Large aircraft carry satellite equipment that occasionally sends a tiny automatic signal. Not coordinates, not a message, just a technical handshake. A pulse that says, in effect, I am still here. These signals were never designed to track lost aircraft, but engineers realized something crucial. By measuring the timing of each satellite handshake, they could estimate the plane's distance from the satellite at that moment, not the exact location. A ring. MH370 sent 7 of these signals after it vanished. The last came almost 7 hours after it disappeared from civilian radar. 7 hours. The aircraft had been flying through the dark while the world searched the wrong ocean. The satellite data produced 2 possible corridors, one north toward Central Asia, one south into the Indian Ocean. The northern route made little sense. A Boeing 777 crossing India, Pakistan, or China would almost certainly have been detected by military radar. No one reported it. That left the south. A flight into one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth. No islands, no regular shipping lanes, no witnesses, just thousands of kilometers of water, with depths reaching 5 kilometers. If you were placed there in a lifeboat, land could be 1,000 kilometers away in every direction. It is not just remote. It is almost nowhere. Whoever sent MH370, there chose a place where a plane could disappear for good, and almost succeeded. 7 hours after takeoff, the satellite received its final handshake. Then silence. No more signals, no radio calls, no emergency beacon. Nothing. So what happened inside the cockpit? Who turned the aircraft away from Beijing? Who shut down the communication systems? Who guided a Boeing 777 deep into the Indian Ocean through the middle of the night? Investigators narrowed the possibilities to 3 major theories. The first was mechanical failure. Maybe a fire broke out. Maybe an electrical short disabled critical systems. Maybe the cabin lost pressure and the crew became incapacitated. At first glance, that sounds reasonable. But there was a problem. A crippled aircraft does not execute deliberate turns across an entire country. It does not navigate around radar coverage. It does not maintain a controlled flight path for 7 hours. Something, or someone, was still flying that plane. The second theory was hijacking. Perhaps someone forced their way into the cockpit and took control. Attention immediately focused on 2 Iranian passengers traveling with stolen passports. Headlines exploded across the world. Terrorism seemed like the obvious answer. But investigators quickly discovered the men were not extremists. They were migrants trying to reach Europe illegally. No terrorist organization claimed responsibility. No demands were made. No message was ever sent. And that raised another question. If this was terror, why disappear into empty ocean instead of targeting a city? If it was extortion, why remain silent forever? The theory collapsed under its own emptiness. That left the third explanation, the one many aviation experts quietly consider the most likely. Someone inside the cockpit did it intentionally. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah was 53 years old, highly experienced, respected, and deeply passionate about aviation. After the disappearance, investigators searched his home and seized his flight simulator, a sophisticated setup with multiple screens and professional controls. Among thousands of stored practice flights, investigators found one route that immediately drew attention: a simulated flight departing Kuala Lumpur, turning west, then south, ending in the Indian Ocean after fuel exhaustion. It wasn't identical to MH370's suspected route, but it was disturbingly close. The FBI analyzed the data. The discovery spread across the world within days. For many people, it felt like the missing piece of the puzzle, but it still was not proof. Pilots often simulate random routes. Flight enthusiasts recreate journeys across the entire globe. One strange route inside thousands of files is not a confession. Investigators also learned Zahari had been struggling personally. Reports mentioned family tension and political frustration. But millions of people experience stress without murdering hundreds of strangers. The evidence remained circumstantial, and yet the pieces fit too well to ignore. The aircraft's deliberate turns, the shutdown of communication systems, the apparent understanding of radar blind spots, the long controlled flight into remote ocean, all of it suggested knowledge, precision, and intent. Still, those who knew Zahari described someone completely different from the image forming around him. Friends called him warm and generous. He loved cooking for coworkers. He uploaded videos online about repairing appliances and electronics. Neighbors described him as calm, polite, almost gentle. But that detail appears in nearly every tragedy like this. People capable of horrifying acts rarely look monstrous from the outside. They look ordinary, because often they are ordinary, until something inside breaks. The investigation never found a definitive smoking gun. No confession, no message, no hard evidence proving the captain deliberately destroyed the aircraft. Without the black boxes, certainty may never exist, and that uncertainty has become the defining feature of MH370. In 2018, Malaysia released its final official report. It concluded that the aircraft's systems were probably disabled intentionally, and that the plane was likely being manually controlled after the turnback. But the report stopped short of naming who was responsible. Families called it evasive. Independent investigators accused authorities of avoiding the most uncomfortable conclusion, that one of their own pilots may have deliberately vanished an airliner. Then came another unbearable question. What happened to the passengers during those 7 hours? Did they know? Did they understand where they were going? The most likely scenario is also the least horrifying. If someone in the cockpit depressurized the aircraft at high altitude, oxygen levels inside the cabin would have collapsed within minutes. At cruising altitude, the human body cannot survive long without pressurization. Oxygen masks only provide about 15 minutes of supply. After that, passengers lose consciousness. Quietly. Hypoxia does not feel violent at first. People become confused, sleepy, detached. Then they drift away. If that happened aboard MH370, most people on the aircraft may have fallen unconscious long before the plane reached the Indian Ocean. They may never have known what was happening. And there is one haunting detail investigators still cannot fully explain. During those final 7 hours, not a single passenger made contact with the outside world. No phone calls, no text messages, no signals. 239 people disappeared into silence. For more than a year, the ocean gave nothing back. No bodies, no floating luggage, no wreckage field. It was as if the aircraft had been swallowed whole. Then, in July 2015, a man walking along a beach on Reunion Island found a large piece of debris covered in shells and barnacles. Investigators confirmed it was part of a Boeing 777 wing, part of MH370. After that, more fragments began appearing across the western Indian Ocean, in Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, even South Africa. Over 30 pieces were eventually linked to the missing aircraft. Sections of interior paneling, fragments of wing structure, broken cabin components carried thousands of kilometers by currents and storms. Every piece felt deeply personal. A damaged luggage panel, where someone had stored a suitcase before takeoff. A torn section of fuselage beside a window, where someone may have stared into the night hours before the end. Proof that the aircraft had not vanished into fantasy or conspiracy. It had crashed. Some of the wreckage revealed something even darker. One fragment showed signs of extreme impact force against the water. That detail mattered, because it suggested two very different endings. In one scenario, the aircraft became uncontrollable after fuel exhaustion. The autopilot disconnected. The plane spiraled downward, accelerated violently, and slammed into the ocean at enormous speed. But another possibility terrified investigators even more. Someone may have still been controlling the aircraft until the final seconds. If the plane was deliberately driven steeply into the water, it would have shattered differently, leaving far less debris floating on the surface and making recovery dramatically harder. It sounded horrifying, but it also explained why so little had been found. And yet, the central mystery remained untouched. Where was the main wreckage? Australia launched one of the most expensive underwater searches in aviation history. More than $200 million were spent scanning enormous sections of the Indian Ocean floor. Advanced underwater vehicles crawled across depths of 4 and 5 kilometers, mapping terrain no human eyes had ever seen before. Nothing. A second search followed years later. Again, nothing. The aircraft was somewhere below them, but the ocean was too vast. People often imagine the seafloor as flat, empty darkness. It is not. The search teams discovered underwater mountains, volcanic ridges, cliffs, trenches, valleys, and jagged formations rising kilometers from the seabed. Before MH370, large parts of that region had barely been mapped at all. Charts showed smooth blue emptiness. Reality looked more like an alien mountain range hidden beneath black water. The aircraft could be buried inside a canyon, wedged against a volcanic slope, covered by sediment and marine growth after years underwater. A 60-meter aircraft sounds enormous. In the deep ocean, it is microscopic. Search crews described the psychological torture of the mission. Underwater drones moved slowly through darkness using sonar, scanning the seafloor meter by meter, like blind creatures feeling through the void. Every suspicious shape triggered hope. Operators would freeze as an object appeared on the screen. Something long, metallic, wing-shaped. Cameras descended. Lights switched on. And the object became another rock, another ridge, another illusion. Dozens of false alarms turned into hundreds. The hardest part was not exhaustion. It was repeatedly believing they had finally found the aircraft, and losing that belief minutes later. In 2024, a private company announced plans for another search using improved technology and updated calculations. New underwater drones can scan faster and with greater precision than those used a decade earlier. There is cautious hope that MH370 could still be found. But even if investigators locate the wreckage, answers are not guaranteed. The aircraft's black boxes stopped transmitting years ago when their batteries died on the ocean floor. After more than a decade under crushing pressure and corrosive saltwater, the devices themselves may be heavily damaged. If they are recovered, investigators might hear 30 minutes of silence, or 30 minutes that explain everything. The disappearance of MH370 permanently changed aviation. After the disaster, international regulators introduced new tracking requirements, so passenger aircraft could no longer vanish for hours without location updates. Procedures between military and civilian radar systems were revised. Cockpit access rules became stricter. Psychological screening for pilots received greater attention. Every one of those changes traces back to this single flight. 239 people died, and their deaths may ultimately save thousands more. But for the families, MH370 is not an aviation mystery. It is unfinished grief, no bodies, no graves, no final goodbye. Psychologists call it ambiguous loss, a form of mourning where the mind cannot fully accept death because certainty never arrives. Families remain trapped between hope and despair. Every new theory reopens the wound. Every new search drags the past back to the surface. And maybe that is the most unbearable part of all. Not the conspiracy theories, not the missing aircraft, not the terrifying technical details, but the ordinary lives frozen in place since that night in March 2014. Somewhere in Beijing, a mother still keeps a phone charger beside the bed because her son asked her to charge his phone before the flight. Somewhere in Kuala Lumpur, children grew up without a father who left for a business trip and never came home. Somewhere in Australia, an elderly woman still sets 2 plates on the table each morning, one for herself and one for the husband who vanished 11 years ago. For the world, MH370 became the greatest mystery in aviation history. For them, it became something far simpler, a sentence that never received its final word.